Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Gaukroger. He is Emeritus Professor of History of Philosophy and History of Science at the University of Sydney. And today we're going to talk about his new book, The Failures of Philosophy, a historical essay. So, Dr. Gaukroger, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Okay, so by the way, before we start, let me just say that I found the book very interesting. So, I read quite a bit of philosophy, and the idea of the failures of philosophy really caught me. So,
Sure.
yeah. So, but just to make things clear here from the very start, when you want to tackle the failures of philosophy in the book, what kind of failures are you really aiming at? Is it failures in the way philosophy in general works, the way it tackles questions, or is it the failures of specific schools of thought, specific theories? What is it exactly?
Well, the standard view is that you couldn't have failures of philosophy as such. You could only have failures of particular philosophical schools or views or theories. So the book sets out to challenge that. And it does that by looking at a number of different chronologically distinct self-conceptions of philosophy. So for the purposes of the book, I'm saying there isn't just one philosophy. There are different types of philosophy, so to speak, historically speaking, which have very definite aims, such as the good life in ancient philosophy, and trying to present a theory of everything in the case of 19th century philosophy and later, and that by their own criteria, these projects fail, and they not only fail, but the questions that they raise are so important that something else takes over from philosophy. Something else that we all recognize isn't philosophy takes over from philosophy. And in that sense, the failure of philosophy is kind of magnified, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And what can we learn, particularly speaking, what can philosophers learn by studying the ways philosophy failed or fails even nowadays?
Well, the first thing they can learn is that the history of philosophy is not just some kind of continuous story that leads to the present. There's not some, at least for the kind of purposes that I'm interested in, there's not some common story. There's a number of different things that have been concerned with different problems, that have had different kinds of success, that have failed in different ways. And I want to bring out the distinctiveness of those. Now, of course, one can go back to earlier periods and find things that one finds interesting or stimulating, but that doesn't mean there's a genuine continuity between one's own problems and those of the past. So the first thing I want to, if you like, bring to light is that philosophy does not have a continuous history. And that, I think, is as much of a shock to many philosophers as the idea that it's possible for philosophy itself to actually fail. Not just particular theories, but philosophy itself to fail. But philosophy itself here means the big philosophical projects, of which there are 3 or 4 throughout the history of the discipline.
Yes, because even when I personally studied philosophy in school, the idea that I guess me and most people get is that philosophy started with the Greeks and they set basically the most important questions out there to explore, and then across history, what people did was basically tackle those same questions in different ways with different schools of thoughts, with different methods, etc. For example, you even get quotes like I can't remember exactly who said this, but someone said that the history of philosophy was just footnotes on Plato. So basically, Plato supposedly had set up all the important questions out there, and people were just elaborating on them or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very superficial reading of philosophy. Now, if you're teaching people who've done no philosophy before in a first year course, then that's relatively harmless. You kind of homogenize the discipline, you kind of give it some kind of identity across time, and you give it some kind of dignity, so to speak, by saying, you know, it's really the most ancient intellectual discipline, or something like that. So fine at that level. But if you want to probe a bit, and if you want to raise more substantive questions about philosophy, if you want to raise historiographical questions about whether the philosophical enterprise has changed radically, what kinds of problems it's faced, whether it's faced very specific problems or whether it just always faces the same problem. If you want to do that, then ancient philosophy looks very different from other kinds of philosophy. Obviously, one can go back and find things in Plato, for example, and say, yes, well, this is like, you know, is knowledge justified true belief? Well, Plato, you know, asked that. I'm not sure he does actually, but let's say Plato asked that and we ask that still. You can do that, yeah. And at one level, that's fine. But a more probing attitude to philosophy means that you've got to go much deeper and look in a contextualized way at just what people were asking, why they were asking those questions, and if you like, what the non-philosophical competition was. Because we think of the non-philosophical competition as either being religion or science, but actually it's much more complicated than that when you kind of look at the thing in a bit more detail.
Yes, and we'll get into those questions later about the relationship between philosophy, science, and perhaps religion as well. But by studying the failures of philosophy, even if there's this discontinuity of philosophy across history, or within philosophy across history, can these failures tell us anything about what philosophy is and what it is for?
Yes, but not in the sense in which you mean it. It can tell us that philosophy is not some single thing. There are techniques that might go across the history of these disciplines, but philosophy is not, put it this way, it isn't a straightforward kind of discourse that deals, for example, through conceptual analysis by contrast with empirical inquiry. That doesn't rely on dogma, that relies on critical argument and the rest of it. There's not. That's fine, but again, it's too superficial if you want to really probe and press philosophy a little bit more. So what it can tell us is that this is history. Philosophy is a problematic discourse in its history. It's not straightforward. I mean, particularly, it's not teleological. It doesn't lead to the present. Now, I know quite a few philosophers still assume that all philosophy leads to the present. Most historians of philosophy wouldn't accept that, and a lot of other philosophers would think that that was a very naive view. But trying to formulate what its motor is, what it does do, that's the hard bit, and that's really what I've tried to do.
Right. Can we say, or is it possible to say that there's been progress in philosophy in the sense that, for example, just assuming, I don't know if this is an objective you have as a philosopher or not, but assuming that one of the objectives of philosophy would be to arrive at or get closer to the truth. Do you think that in that way we can talk about progress in philosophy or not?
Truth's a rather problematic notion, so I wouldn't put it in terms of truth. I'd put it in terms of having better, deeper, better supported accounts of things. And in that sense, within particular programs, Yes, of course, you can. So within logic, for example, clearly, but there's not talking in terms of truth. I think it makes adds an extra element that doesn't help in describing what this progress consists in. I don't think there's progress from antiquity to the modern era, but I do think that within particular periods there's progress, and there's also regress, of course. And historians of philosophy are probably the best people to identify the latter.
Right, so let's walk then through some of the history of philosophy. Can we say exactly when philosophy started?
Um, so long as you don't expect a straightforward answer, yes. Because, I mean, I'd say philosophy starts with Plato. There are now, in the context of Plato's thought, and particularly later on that of his pupil Aristotle, there are earlier figures who've made certain moves that, in the context of Plato and Aristotle, make sense as philosophical moves. But I think, in their own right, they they don't have much standing in their own right. So if you take the kind of genuine pre-Socratics, and I wouldn't, for various reasons, I wouldn't include Thales here, but if you take Anaximander and Parmenides, and maybe Heraclitus, for example, if there'd been no Plato or Aristotle to follow up, we wouldn't have a philosophical tradition. We wouldn't have anything that we could recognize as a philosophical tradition. But once these are incorporated into and made sense of in terms of the larger project of Plato and then Aristotle, then we've got philosophy. So it starts with Plato because you don't have anything recognizably philosophical before that, except that Plato and Aristotle make certain earlier developments philosophical that in their own right, you couldn't call them philosophical, I don't think.
Mhm. It's interesting that you say that it starts with Plato and then you mentioned the pre-Socratics a little bit. So where do you position Socrates? Because of course we usually do not say pre-Platonics, but
Yes,
pre-Socratics, right?
yeah, we do. We just don't know enough about Socrates and what on earth he's doing. We get different accounts in Plato and in the other authors. Some people treat him as a sophist, which is fine. The sophists are part of the philosophical tradition as well. It's not always clear what he's up to. For Plato, the point of kind of Socratic questioning is to get to a particular goal, namely the good life. It's not clear that that's what Socrates was doing. I mean, Plato presents him as something like that at times, but we just don't know enough about Socrates. And I think Socrates, if it had just been Socrates in a Socratic tradition, I think you'd have a very different kind of a very different kind of history, a very different cultural history. I mean, think of all those later writers who identified Socrates and Jesus as very similar kinds of characters, raising the same kind of moral questions, probing and the rest of it. I can see without Plato and Aristotle, that's a tradition that Socrates could have been placed in, and it's by our standards that's not a philosophical tradition. So Plato's the key.
Right. But if you say that philosophy starts with Plato, then in the history of philosophy, what is the role played by the pre-Socratics? Because I mean, usually they are mentioned in the history of philosophy.
They are now. That starts with Hegel. It's not prior to, as I understand it, prior to Hegel, no one talks about the pre-Socratics as part of
Okay.
no one systematically includes them in the picture. I mean, people like Heraclitus might be mentioned, but they're not included. So, and this is something I haven't looked at in detail, the question here is, when and under what conditions were the pre-Socratics included in the philosophical canon? And why were they included? And I think one has to look at very particular historical circumstances. Now, it's true that subsequently, that's all been forgotten and they're just treated as part of the canon. But that's kind of just, that's really just for pedagogic purposes, I think, initially. Since then, there's serious scholarship that tries to work out what the contribution of the pre-Socratics is, but always on the assumption that this is already philosophy. And that's an assumption I think is questionable and has to be thought about, has to be opened up to question.
Mm-hmm. So when looking at the very origins of philosophy with the Greeks, whatever, I mean, either the pre-Socratics or Plato or whatever, I mean, is it that certain domains of philosophy or sub-disciplines appeared at different times, like, for example, metaphysics, aesthetics, ethics, epistemology? Was it something that appeared one after the other over time, or is that not the best way of thinking about it?
Well, they may have appeared over time in some cases, or they may have appeared simultaneously because the connections between them change. So in someone like Aristotle, for example, logic is really not the kind of thing that the aims of logic are quite different from the aims of logic from Frege onwards, from the 19th, 20th century. It's all about explanation. It's not about kind of, I mean, there's a concern with preserving truth in inference, and that's Aristotle's contribution in modern terms. But Aristotle's interested in much more than that from logic. He wants logic to produce genuine explanatory conclusions. And that's not something that modern logicians think is possible, and it wasn't possible for Aristotle either. But for Aristotle and for the Stoics, the whole tradition of ancient logic went beyond just truth preservation. It went to big, substantive, explanatory questions. So the whole context within which he pursued this study means it's got a different kind of connection with ethics, with epistemology and metaphysics than has subsequently been the case. And that I think is a very important aspect of a contextual understanding of what ancient philosophers are doing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a relationship between these different domains? For example, is there a relationship between metaphysics and epistemology, or epistemology and ethics? I mean, do we need to have the questions in a particular domain settled? Like, for example, what exists or what can we know about the world to know how we should conduct ourselves in the world, or something like that?
Well, historically, metaphysics changed character very radically. There were various different and conflicting expectations put on metaphysics in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
By the time you get to Descartes, it's a highly epistemologized metaphysics. It's not about what there is, it's about how you can know what there is, what kind of resources, knowledge resources you can depend on. I think by the 18th century, particularly in the tradition of Locke, the two get separated to some extent, and epistemology gets pursued somewhat independently of metaphysics. There's a revival of metaphysics of sorts in German idealism. There's a very different kind of revival with Bertrand Russell and British analytic philosophy. They have different relationships, and metaphysics has been asked to solve very different kinds of questions. Now, there's one level, I should say that there is one level at which, yeah, it's all metaphysics. That's fine for some purposes. That is not fine for all purposes. And if one's going to probe more deeply, or have a greater historical sense as to what's going on, these enterprises may have something in common, but they have so much that's not in common that it's very misleading to treat them as part of the same exercise.
Right. But then let me ask you, just to take a step back, In what ways were Christian theologians influenced by ancient philosophy? And I mean, how would you look at the role that they played in the history of philosophy?
I think it's a crucial role. It's, I mean, for one thing, remember that Aristotle, after his death, Aristotelianism was very marginal in the Greek and Hellenistic world. I mean, Plato, people were Platonists, they were Stoics, they were Epicureans, but Aristotle was completely marginal. Aristotle only really becomes a significant figure with in the 13th century, maybe a little bit of it, but certainly in the 13th century with the scholastics, who see him as providing a solution, who see us as providing the resources to deal with what are effectively theological problems. The Trinity, transubstantiation. He's got a theory of substance that fits the program very well. And that program is really a theological program. It's designed to convert non-Christians, and it's designed to deal with heretics. So it's a way of formulating orthodoxy. And Aristotelianism, except on one issue, the immortality of the soul, did that very effectively. Prior to that, Platonism or Neoplatonism is absolutely crucial in formulating Christian theology from the early centuries onwards, particularly in someone like Augustine. He just translates Platonism into Christian terms. So the link between Christianity and metaphysics is an ancient metaphysics is very tight. And I might also add that, of course, Aristotelianism doesn't come from nowhere into the 13th century Christian tradition. It comes through the Arabic philosophers, particularly in the 12th century Averroes. So you have a very sophisticated Aristotelian philosophy that then gets taken over by Christian theologians, though they don't always understand where it's coming from, and it provides the same kind of support for theological doctrines as it did for the Arabic philosophers.
Mm-hmm. And is there a particular point in history where the influence of Aristotle and Plato goes away in any way?
It goes away by the 17th century, more or less. Platonism starts going away in the 17th century. There are Platonists of sorts in England. There are people who take Plato seriously, humanists still going into the 17th century. But there's a massive decline in the 17th century. Aristotle, similarly, in most, certainly in terms of natural philosophy or science, in terms of metaphysics, which by this stage is intimately connected with his natural philosophy or science. Ethics is a bit different because Aristotle's virtue ethics has been subsequently revived against consequentialism and Kantianism and things like that, on the grounds that it's an ethics that makes judgment depend on character and intentions and things like that. By contrast with, in the extreme case, consequentialism, utilitarianism, which jettisons questions of character.
Mm-hmm. What happens? What happens particularly in Europe with the arrival of naturalism? I mean, what sorts of changes did it bring with it?
The term naturalism is used in very different ways. In the 18th century, there's a form of naturalism which is medically based. Basically, the argument there is that philosophers have had metaphysical and epistemological theories about the nature of mind, but they haven't looked at the physiology of the brain or anything like that. They haven't looked at medical symptoms. They've treated the mind in a completely abstract terms, whereas for these medical philosophers, what you need to do is you need to look at the mind in terms of healthy minds, unhealthy minds, and the rest of it, and you need to get a larger picture. By the 19th century, there's a much more general form of naturalization, which is that the kinds of problems that philosophy has directed itself to, and what these people have in mind is German idealism. They are Some of them are genuine problems, but philosophy is hopeless. It can't deal with any of these problems. But they're still serious problems. So you need some other discipline, and that discipline is science. And this is basically a physics, to some extent, physiology-based notion of how you deal with the ultimate problems. And the issue, and one interesting issue there, I think, that I tried to bring out is that for Kant and the German idealists, for the first time, philosophy becomes construed as the theory of everything. It had never been thought of in those terms previously, but Kant and the German idealists think it's the theory of everything. When that collapses, scientists, particularly in Germany and then in the 20th century more generally, still see the big project as a theory of everything. They still think that's a viable, plausible kind of exercise. Completely wrongly, in my view, but they think that's something that you should aim at. And they think that the only way to do that is science. So what does philosophy do then? Well, basically, it supports science by, amongst other things, trying to develop a theory of the unity of science. After all, if science is the theory of everything, it can explain everything. What's the role of philosophy? Well, philosophy can show how all the bits are connected, and there's unity of science. And one thing I argue in the book, and else in much greater detail elsewhere, is that this is a completely misguided project. There is no unity of science. It's never worked, it's never been a plausible aim, and it's often been a great obstacle to scientific understanding. But that's what happens when you have this big project of a theory of everything.
Mhm. But do you look at philosophy and science as being separate or not?
Um, well, my original work from my PhD onwards was in early modern science as much as anything. And in the 17th century, particularly, it's very difficult to separate science and philosophy. Philosophy becomes really natural philosophy, and they're very intimately connected. And since then, I've been very interested in how the relation between the two develops. They haven't just been separated. To some extent, as in this Unity of Science project, they've actually come together again as mutually reinforcing disciplines. So I've been very concerned to look at how that's happened and why it's happened, and what the particular moves are. So it really depends on the period. It depends on how you think of what science is doing and what scientific resources you've got. And above all, it depends on the big question, which I've tried to raise as a question. I don't have answers. The big question: what's the point of philosophy? What's it supposed to be doing? What would success look like? What is it doing that other disciplines don't or can't do? What do you need to know to do philosophy? What do you need to study to do philosophy? I don't have any pat answers to those things, but I think if philosophers don't ask those questions, they might as well go home, because this is a core form of intellectual inquiry that philosophers traditionally have been concerned with. And if philosophers are now, not all of them, but those philosophers who are concerned with narrow technical issues, I'm not sure that they're even doing philosophy anymore. And they're certainly not thinking in broad terms about what they're doing.
Right. But did people traditionally think about philosophy as being separate from other forms of knowledge? Like, for example, I'm not sure if religion would be another form of knowledge or not, and science, because, for example, there were things and methods that people were developing even before the scientific revolution that perhaps would also be considered science. But how did people think about the relationship between different forms and ways of knowledge?
Well, one answer is the question of priority. What stands? What if there seem to be equal reasons for pursuing different paths? How do you decide if there's an overriding path? And obviously, religion's pretty important there. But then, so science becomes very important there as well. And indeed, in some sense, science just takes over a role that it's had from religion. But there are other things. So there's a case I was looking at recently in the 18th century, where 18th century philosophers were worried about progress, the progress of knowledge, and they were concerned, the French philosophers were concerned about the Middle Ages and why things seemed to go backwards in the Middle Ages and how they got themselves out of that. And one thing that, and obviously they thought it was science rather than metaphysics or religion that had dragged knowledge out of the Middle Ages. But there was also a concern about Christian morality and how you formulate it, how you defend Christian morality against atheists, heretics, Muslims, the rest of it. And the view was that you need to, and this was really a humanist view, but it was adhered to more generally in the 17th century particularly. The view was that you need to, that Christian morality by itself is hopeless. Christian thought by itself is hopeless. It needs to be formulated in terms of a Greco-Roman philosophy. It needs to have the resources and the kind of tools that philosophy provides. Now, that had been true of theology earlier, and it remained true in areas like ethics, particularly, and in other areas. And one view was that if you didn't pursue these things in philosophical terms, if you didn't pursue these religious concerns in philosophical terms, you'd be stuck like people were in the Middle Ages. It wouldn't be able to defend itself against other religions or anything like that. It would just be a dead end. Whereas the view in the 17th and 18th century by religious philosophers was that using the tools of ancient philosophy, or maybe more recent philosophy, wisely enabled you to give an articulate defense of Christian and other values. So it was an integral part of defending a particular kind of mentality. At the same time, of course, there were those who used those tools to undermine Christian morality and other forms of morality. And in that context, philosophy became, in terms of priorities, became the thing that could trump other forms of understanding, particularly religion, not science, but particularly religion. So there you have a complex relation between philosophy and theology, and it doesn't necessarily go in the way that its kind of promoters had wanted or expected. There's all kinds of contingencies.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, isn't the relationship between philosophy and theology or religion a bit complicated? I mean, isn't it the case that, for example, Christian theologians, many of them were also philosophers, and they were doing things like metaphysics, ethics, I mean, arguably even epistemology, they were using logic in their writing. So, I mean, what is really the relationship there? Can we say that theologians are also philosophers in a sense?
Oh, certainly. But it depends what you... Here's the question that I try and raise of motivation. Why are you dealing with these problems in the first place? And why are you dealing with them philosophically? You're dealing with these problems, so take, Aquinas, for example. What are the basic problems that you're trying to solve using philosophy? They're not philosophical problems, they're theological problems. They're problems about transubstantiation, the Trinity, the personal immortality, and the rest of it. The way in which these have been formulated in Platonist terms don't work. It gets you into all kinds of problems. You can't deal with motions of substance and the rest of it that you need to be able to deal with. So you go to Aristotelianism, and Aristotelianism works really well in most cases. So here you have a successful, and then in someone like Aquinas, with fantastic philosophical sophistication, you kind of formulate your theology in philosophical terms. And I think that's how theologians, certainly into the 17th and 18th century, and maybe now, deal with these things. They use the resources of philosophy, but the original problems, or the problems that these things are directed towards, are philosophical problems. And this raises the question of philosophy being a resource to deal with problems from outside philosophy itself, moral, political, scientific, religious problems. And what happens when it becomes completely self-referential, when it only deals with its own internally generated problems. And I've kind of I touch on that towards the end of the book, but that's something just to provoke thought. It's not that I have any answers on that. I mean, I have opinions, but I don't have any answers on it.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into some more general questions, I would like to ask you specifically about a thing that particularly the Enlightenment philosophers dealt with in the domain of epistemology. So
Right.
the ways they talked about reason, sensibility, and things like that. I mean, what was novel about the ways they did epistemology back then, particularly people like Kant and the empiricists and so on? I mean, did they have any new ways of thinking about where knowledge came from, how people acquired knowledge, and so on, that we don't find in earlier philosophers?
Yes, definitely, in lots of cases. Let me just give you one example. Locke's Essay on Human Understanding. The first book of the Essay on Human Understanding deals with the question of innate ideas. Now, this is a standard epistemological problem in the 17th century, deriving from Descartes. It's there in Leibniz, of course, and it looks like a classic case of pure conceptual analysis. It's a question of a conceptual analysis of logic of knowledge. Book one of Locke's essay on innate ideas. He doesn't discuss philosophical texts. You look at all the references; they're all to travel books, not travel brochures, but travel reports, it's an empirical discipline, and he just sets out the massive variety of conceptions that people have. And that's the argument, that's the most telling argument against innate ideas, because there couldn't possibly be innate, and he's particularly concerned with moral ones, but across the spectrum, you couldn't possibly have innate ideas given this huge variation, an almost infinite variation in ideas. And then in that Lockean tradition, and really the Lockeans are in France, they're the Enlightenment philosophers rather than in England, in that Lockean tradition, using empirical information as a basis for knowledge is absolutely crucial. Now, often this is done in terms of rationalism versus empiricism, but that's very misleading because it looks like you've got, one system which says you start from truths of reason, another system which says you start from truths of experience, but in the second case, the so-called empiricists are all of them virtually anti-system. One of the things that it isn't just that they say that knowledge must start from sensation. They're also saying just as stridently, you can't be a system builder. This system building is completely out. That's where people go wrong. That's where people went wrong in the Middle Ages, and that's where the likes of Descartes and co. went wrong as well. That it's that systems out. That is not the way to pursue philosophy or understanding. So that's one, and there are lots of other cases. So Bonnet, Charles Bonnet, who people don't really know about these days. I've just translated his essay on the analysis of the faculties of the soul. Bonnet, this is 1650s. He's the 1750s. He's the first person to physiologize the soul. His kind of empiricism is that it's all got to be done in terms of the physiology of the sensory systems, nervous systems, physiology of the brain. It's not reductionist. That's to say, he thinks that you can identify a locus of the soul and the rest of it. And he also thinks that that all animals have personal identity, for example. It's a very radical kind of view, but no one in the 17th century would have contemplated anything along those lines. And even though it's quite extreme in the 18th century, it's still an indication of how radical 18th century thinkers are. And Hume, Hume says, yeah, metaphysics is great. It gives us a tool for thinking more deeply about problems. But if you've got any sense, you must know when to stop, because if you don't stop, you just go mad effectively. Metaphysics is a dead end, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue it. It means that you should use your judgment to know when it comes to an end. Again, I don't think anyone in the 17th century could have possibly had a view like that. So it's very, very radical until Kant. And then Kant reintroduces metaphysics. I mean, he really goes back to a more 17th century project.
Right. Would you say that over time, and particularly more so in more recent times, philosophy has been losing prestige, particularly with the advent of science?
It's been losing prestige, and yeah, the advent of science has been a very important factor. I mean, if you think about it, theology also has been losing prestige radically, divinity. And I'm not sure that the kinds of things that have undermined the prestige of theology or divinity are that different from there isn't some overlap between those and the kinds of things that have undermined the prestige of philosophy. So let me give an example. In the 1950s, I think it was, in Britain, there were BBC radio programs, and they had, maybe a bit earlier than maybe 1950s. They had Bertrand Russell as the philosopher. They had Copleston, the history of philosophy. Copleston is the theologian, and they had others. And they had a reasonable audience, and people would listen in. And you had, the philosopher speaks, and the theologian speaks, and maybe the scientist speaks. And you had three different, not necessarily opposing, but different kinds of approach to the subject matter. And the first two dropped out. And now, you have, particularly in the television era, you don't have philosophers on television. You don't have theologians on television, in at least not in peak hour anyway. But you do have scientists with big documentaries and the rest of it. So maybe there's a connection between the failures of divinity and the failures of philosophy. Now, this doesn't mean that they have the same standing, because they don't. But there's a kind of... Okay, what it means is you've got to take into account various cultural factors. It's not just an internally generated thing. It's not that philosophy's lost its way, therefore it's lost its kind of public standing, or divinity's lost its way, it's lost its public standing. That may be a factor, but there's a far more general cultural thing about what people look to answer fundamental questions. And one thing I've looked at really quite over a long time now is this idea of the persona of the philosopher and the persona of the scientist. That's to say, what standing does one have simply in virtue of being a philosopher? Not what views one might have, but simply in virtue of being a philosopher, what standing does one have? What standing does one have simply in virtue of being a scientist, irrespective of one's views? And the same with a theologian and maybe others. And the persona has changed radically. There was a time, 17th and 18th century, where the persona of the philosopher was such that you had a voice, so to speak, simply in virtue of being a philosopher, irrespective of your particular doctrines. And in some respects, maybe European philosophy has been a little bit like that in Germany, in Italy, and France. Philosophy has a kind of standing, quite independently of what the doctrines are. It has a kind of standing that it hasn't had in Anglophone countries. So I think the thing there is you've got to be, these questions are really complicated and they involve all kinds of cultural issues, and philosophers are not competent or trained to deal with those cultural issues. Now, I'd say, wake up, philosophers, because you've got to, those are the kind of things you've got to, my own view is you find a really interesting question that's consequential, that hasn't been dealt with properly, or that people have misrecognized or something like that. And you ask, what resources do you need to deal with this kind of question? And, as someone trained in philosophy, obviously, if it doesn't require any philosophical resources, then you are not the person to do it. But if it's a really interesting, significant question, it's quite likely that you're going to have to build up other resources. For, in my kinds of interest, you're going to have to understand a lot more about science, a lot more about social and cultural history, and a lot more about the history of theology. Now, if you think that that's not my job, I'm a philosopher, then the odds are you're just going to carry on with narrow, internally generated problems that no one outside the discipline's got any interest in. Hardly anyone in the discipline has any interest in. You look at readership of articles in top philosophy journals, the last figures I saw, a bit hard to tell now, and they're like, top articles get 5% of readership or something. I mean, it's really, sorry, five people have read it in some top journal. It just becomes, okay, it's a bit like religion. Philosophers think that philosophy is crucial for universities, and it's a disaster for universities to get rid of philosophy, and I think that's right. I think it is a disaster. But they see, religion departments getting kind of closed down or something like that, and they feel completely immune from that because they feel that they're doing something that's really important, whereas religion departments, God's a non-referring expression, so it's all kind of fiction or fantasy anyway, so what's the point? But you look at university administrators and they think, in my experiences, particularly scientists, many of them think, well, religion, philosophy, they're pretty harmless. They get bums on seats. But if they stop getting bums on seats, then we'll close them down. They're not doing their job. So I think philosophers have a very kind of misleading, optimistic view about the standing of their discipline. So what's the answer? Do something about it. And I think the only way you can do something about it is by combining the resources of philosophy with other disciplines, so that you can direct your attention to big consequential problems. And to some extent that's happened in ethics and maybe a couple of other areas, philosophy of life sciences and things, but in the main it hasn't. But that seems to me the only direction that one has to go on, and one should not suffer under any illusions about the general standing of philosophy, not just in the popular media but in universities.
Are there questions that only philosophy can tackle and answer? Because, nowadays, for example, you get people, of course, this is a minority position, but you have things like scientism, where people say that basically science can answer any sort of question under the sun. But do you think that there are questions that still only philosophy can answer them?
Well, there have been periods where only philosophy could answer the questions, and that's where, for example, where science is very underdeveloped, like in classical Greece. And certainly scholastic theologians thought there were problems that only philosophy could answer, using that as a resource to help. Are there now? There are different schools of philosophy. I mean, in the fields of philosophy, I hardly looked at different modern schools, but that becomes an issue when you ask that kind of question. So there's a phenomenological tradition that certainly thinks that there's a very distinctive way of doing philosophy, and it yields things that other disciplines can't mirror. Analytic philosophy, I don't know, it depends how you think of it. I mean, some philosophers think of analytic philosophy as being think of it on the model of mathematics, particularly on the model of Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, which is not really a great model, since mathematicians don't take the faintest notice of it. They think that it's a kind of conceptual analysis, and it's like doing maths. It's a non-empirical, purely conceptual thing that may have physical consequences, like, geometry, arithmetic have physical consequences, philosophy might have physical consequences. But there's a level at which but in itself, it's a purely conceptual kind of enterprise. Some philosophers think that. There's a big downside to that, particularly in areas like the use of decision theory in ethics, where you work out some kind of comprehensive system of ethics that has no relation whatsoever with politics or the complex situations under which decision making takes place, or the kind of affective states of people and the rest of it. People make an effort to do those, but they're starting from a hopeless kind of premise, which is ultimately this is a conceptual exercise. You get the conceptual stuff right, and then maybe you can kind of flash it out with a bit of politics or sociology or something like that once you've got the conceptual base. Whereas, I'm inclined to go back to someone like Hume, who thinks the best place to do moral and political philosophy is in terms of English constitutional history. I don't think you do it in terms of English constitutional history, but something like that, a historical project. So there may be cases where... Okay, so the question is, are there any consequential cases where it's true, put in these terms, in cases where it's true that philosophy can solve problems that no one else can solve, no other discipline can solve them by itself, are these cases of any consequence or interest, or are they just kind of navel-gazing? I think that's the question.
And do you have any answer to that question?
No. No, I think, in good philosophical tradition, I mean, I have views, certainly, but I think that you have to be able to formulate the arguments and look at the different cases and give a proper assessment. And my views aren't sufficiently well developed for me to be able to kind of say what's right and wrong on that. And it's got to be so qualified that it gets a bit tedious, because it gets buried under the qualifications, maybe. But drawing attention to the problem, that's what I'm trying to do, yeah.
Yes. Do you think that putting science aside, there would be any alternatives to philosophy. I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything out there or if there could hypothetically be some form of knowledge that's not philosophy that could tackle the same questions.
Yeah. Okay, well, one thing that I looked at when looking at the Enlightenment in the failures of philosophy, and I've got more general interest in it, is what happens around 1750 when there's this very general disillusionment with philosophy. Hume says you've got to abandon metaphysics. You've got to know when to abandon metaphysics using your common sense judgment. And common sense trumps. In France, with the so-called médecins philosophes, they say, if you want to understand about morality and the good life and the rest of it, you've got to move into medicine. You've got to look at environmental factors, personal factors, and the rest of it. You can't do it as a form of conceptual analysis or whatever. That gets you nowhere. In Germany, you get the move to literary forms, starting with Lessing. You get the idea that there's something unhealthy about being a philosopher, stuck in your room, kind of writing away with dusty books, doing conceptual stuff. And that the kind of problems or the interesting problems that philosophy had tried to take on and had made boring are still interesting problems, and you pursue those through literature, mainly drama, but various art forms, the novel, drama, maybe epic poetry if you're that way inclined, and then more generally through other art forms. And the idea is that's the way that philosophy needs to go. And interestingly, I discovered in Kant, in his very early years, that's exactly the view that he takes. He says these people pursuing metaphysics, it's a form of mental illness. They want to get out and, do these other, then changes his mind. But and interestingly, that's not in the English translation of the big Kant things, which is a great pity because it's a very different view. I mean, he did change his mind, and he changed his mind very radically. But even so, it shows kind of what was going on at the time. And I think there are subsequently I see just today reading one of the journals that Pippin's got a new book on philosophy and art forms, in which he seems to kind of want a much closer relationship between literature and art and philosophy. And perhaps, as I understand it, I've only looked at the blurb, maybe these other disciplines taking over questions that philosophy has taken over, but hasn't done very well. And there are cases of philosophy where philosophy takes on, just one case, finally, aesthetics. You look at Hume and people like that, and it's all about taste. It's about standards of taste, about objectivity in taste, relativity in taste, and the rest of it. At the end of the century, no one's doing aesthetics like that. The odd philosopher might be, but we don't take any notice of them. It's art history. It's actually looking at particular works of art. You can't do aesthetics in the 19th century without looking at paintings, without later listening to pieces of music, without reading and analyzing novels and the rest of it. What people in the 18th century are doing, they're not even using, in the main, examples of particular paintings or works of art. They're doing it at this kind of ethereal level. And aesthetics, I think, is a particularly interesting area because there you have this major shift. It's not always recognized in the literature, of the philosophical literature. You have this major shift where philosophy, a conceptual approach, is completely replaced by something really quite different, much more concrete. So that's a case where people thought, well, taste, aesthetics, how on earth would you be able to do that if not through philosophy? And then the answer comes.
Right. Do you think that in modern days it's still plausible to talk about the possibility of developing a theory of everything in philosophy?
No. I don't even think philosophers think that. I think to the extent to which philosophers think, sorry, you mean a philosophical theory of everything or some other? Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
yes, a philosophical, yeah.
yeah. I don't think, well, certainly in the Anglo tradition, which is what I know best, I don't think anyone would think that there's a philosophical theory of everything, what they would think, and what seems to me most of them think, and get very upset if you deny it, is that there's a scientific theory of everything, and that philosophers, the philosophical contribution to this is crucial. And the philosophical contribution, which really comes through Hermann Cohen and the Neo-Kantians, the late 19th century, the philosophical contribution is philosophy of science. And, Quine says, I can't remember the exact quote, but he says, that's right, philosophy of science is philosophy enough. You don't need to do any other kind of philosophy. It's all philosophy of science. Why is that? Well, what do you do when you do philosophy of science? You establish the unity of science. You show the connections, but in the end, what you do is you legitimate science as an activity. It's not clear it needs legitimating, but you kind of show that it really is a theory of everything by showing how all the bits are interconnected. And so in that case, philosophy is very much an underlaborer, and it's an underlaborer to establish something that it believes that science alone can't do. Science just does, physics, life sciences, the rest of it. Maybe establishes one or two connections through mechanics or physiology or whatever. But at a meta level, at a conceptual level, you need philosophy to show that this really is a theory of everything, because everything's connected. Mm-hmm. And it's a disaster.
Right. So just one last question, and I think this will be a good point to end on. Looking at the future of philosophy, do you have any ideas about what role philosophy might play in the future in the creation of knowledge, perhaps the relationship between philosophy and science that might develop in the future, and so on?
This is very hard. You can't do philosophy in the modern era without some connection with science. You have to have a view on what science does, I think. You have to have a developed view as to what science does, and you have to have some sense, some historical sense about what philosophy has been doing and why it's been doing it and why things have changed and what the rationale for doing what one is doing is. How those work in practice, I'm really not sure. I don't have any sense of. So what you're really asking is, are there kind of productive areas that philosophy could go in that maybe follow on from what's being pursued at the moment?
And by the way, perhaps I would also add the question, do you think that there's any risk of philosophy becoming completely obsolete?
If university administrators decided that philosophy was a luxury, that what people needed to do was science, it's a kind of third world model of universities, basically, that you just do the sciences. If that happened, philosophy, particularly in the Anglo tradition, not so much in the continental tradition. So, in France, there's teaching of philosophy in schools and the rest of it. But in the Anglo tradition, where philosophy is something done in universities and not really anywhere else, if universities had cut back on the humanities and decided that, well, philosophy should go, but, literature and things are kind of maybe important, but philosophy should go in the way that religion should go, then I think philosophy would be doomed. Anglo philosophy, anyway. I mean, it would have to completely reconvene itself. It would not be able to, I don't think it would not be able to argue that it was a fruitful, legitimate enterprise in its own right. It might be, you can imagine what philosophers would say. Well, they've got these connections with linguistics and mathematics and the rest of it. So then, you bring on a few mathematicians and linguists, and they say, no, we're not interested in what philosophers say about these things. I think philosophy would be in dire straits. without a place in the university education. Having said that, I think universities would be in dire straits without having philosophy as part of their education. But we've had some very, very radical political and cultural changes in the last 20 years, and one can't kind of rule these things out. So I would say that philosophers are living dangerously, perhaps, and some recognition of that might be salutary.
Okay, so the book is again The Failures of Philosophy, a historical essay. Dr. Gaukroger, just before we go, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Legal places.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, there are reviews, I suppose, that one can find on the internet. I don't do blogs, and I don't do social media, so not in that respect. So in the main, no, not compared to many philosophers who do lots of blogs and social media, which, some people listening will say, well, maybe that's what he should be doing, given all these complaints about the irrelevance of philosophy. So, who's to say?
Yeah, okay, so anyway, I will be leaving a link to your book in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thanks for such thoughtful questions. It's great.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please do not forget to support the channel. You can go over to Patreon at patreon.com/the Dissenter. And you also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, leave a comment, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Logorero, Francis Fordens, Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintius, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Meira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Dez Araújo, Ethan Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa. My producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Taffini, Akian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Van Agdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran. And my executive producers: Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.